Esther King had lived alone on her farmland for years. To the drilling men who came in boots and tailored suits, she looked like nothing more than an old black woman with no one to back her. Quiet, isolated, an easy target. They offered money, then pressure, then violence. Tires slashed, animals poisoned, a deadline issued. But what they didn't see was the past she carried. Years as a military sniper, wars fought in silence, battles won in shadows. So when they came in the night to take what was hers, they met something they never expected. Esther didn't fold. She fought like the war had never ended. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning unfolded with the kind of quiet grace that only land tended by memory could offer, and as the first blush of gold spread across the tips of the pecan trees, Esther King stood at the edge of her porch with a mug of coffee held steady in her right hand, her gaze sweeping over the wide expanse of farmland she had inherited, protected, and learned down to the last root and furrow, as if every inch of it were stitched into the fabric of her skin. At 74 years old, her back remained straight, her steps deliberate, and her breath calm. Not because time had spared her, but because she had spent a lifetime training her body to answer only to discipline, not fear, not pain, and certainly not threats. The house behind her, modest in appearance, but fortified in the ways that mattered most, was kept in perfect working order, not for visitors, for there were rarely any, but because order itself was the language she understood best. Nothing in Esther's life was left to chance. The curtains were always drawn in the same rhythm. The stove cleaned the moment it cooled, and the porch swept in even strokes, regardless of whether the wind had been kind or cruel the night before. Her land was more than a home. It was a perimeter, a responsibility, and a living extension of every lesson war had carved into her bones. She had always known the soil beneath her boots held stories far older than the house, and when she began noticing the small disturbances in the soil line near the northern field, the faint chemical odor rising after a storm, the subtle discoloration in the water runoff, the way her late husband's old geological notes had quietly hinted at what might lie deep beneath the surface, she had not panicked, nor had she celebrated. Instead, she made her own assessments, gathered samples, and, without telling a soul, initiated the slow and legally intricate process of securing her mineral rights through a lawyer she trusted 3 counties away, a man who owed her more than one favor and knew better than to speak her name out loud in a public office. It was a quiet maneuver, as careful and calculated as any mission she had led when she wore the uniform, and yet, even with every precaution in place, the news still seemed to travel on wind she couldn't trace, because just weeks after the filings began, strange trucks started appearing near her road, first parked off the gravel shoulder, then moving a little closer each time, always with dark-tinted windows and clean, white exteriors that stood in sharp contrast to the dust-covered locals who worked this land for real. The men inside didn't wear uniforms, but their posture gave them away. Too relaxed for regular contractors, too alert for salesmen, and with eyes that scanned the horizon like men used to walking into rooms they already intended to control. The first time one of them came up her driveway, he did so with a smile so polished it seemed to reflect the sun, wearing a button-down shirt rolled to his elbows, sleeves deliberately casual, as if he wanted to appear approachable, though the sharpness in his voice carried the same clipped edge as a man who wasn't used to being ignored. He introduced himself as a representative of a real estate development group with interest in strategic rural acquisitions, and said his team had heard about the value of her land and hoped to make her an offer that respected her legacy while providing her with the freedom to enjoy the rest of her years without burden. She hadn't invited him to sit. She hadn't offered him coffee. She had listened without blinking, her silence stretching just long enough to force a flicker of discomfort across his otherwise confident face. And when he finally handed her a pristine envelope with gold lettering along the flap and politely suggested she think it over, she took it without a word and waited until he left before she even opened it. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the cicadas filled the dusk with their pulsing rhythm, she stood alone at the edge of her field, with the envelope open in her hand, and the offer inside staring back at her in bold, unapologetic print. A number so large it might have made another woman pause, maybe even dream. But Esther only tilted her head slightly and looked out across the land she had bled for, worked for, buried a husband. On and guarded for decades, not because it was lucrative, but because it was hers in every possible way that mattered. She didn't hesitate. She didn't sigh. She walked back to the house, opened the iron stove door, and fed the offer to the flames, watching without emotion as the paper blackened, curled, and turned to ash. Her face bathed in the soft flicker of heat that meant, in her world, a line had just been crossed, and there would be no retreat, no negotiation, and no warning the next time someone came asking about what lay beneath her ground. By morning, the ash from the envelope had cooled into a soft gray layer at the base of the stove, the only visible evidence of the decision already sealed in her mind. Esther rinsed her mug, tightened the laces on her boots, and stepped onto the porch with the kind of calm that didn't require announcing itself. The early light stretched across the fields in long golden bands, and for a moment, everything looked the same. The distant tree line unmoved, the fencing still standing, the gravel drive still quiet. But there was something different in the air, something subtle, like the feeling of a storm waiting far off the horizon, still hidden but undeniable. She drove to the courthouse as the town was just beginning to stir, the roads still empty, the storefronts locked in silence. Her truck rumbled steady down the cracked asphalt, its bed empty, her passenger seat holding nothing but the manila folder she'd prepared weeks ago. She had signed everything slowly, deliberately, her signature steady across each form. It wasn't just ink. It was claim, intention, defense. The courthouse lobby smelled faintly of floor polish and aging carpet, the kind of scent that seemed trapped in the baseboards no matter how many years passed. Esther stepped inside, nodded politely at the security guard who barely looked up from his crossword, and walked toward the records window where a young clerk with overgelled hair and a name tag that read Derek sat behind a smudged pane of safety glass. She slid the folder across the counter without a word. He glanced up, did a quick double-take like he'd expected someone else, then took the documents with an exaggerated sigh, as though handling paperwork from a woman like her at that hour somehow fell outside the scope of his job description. He scanned the top page, tapped a few keys, and muttered something under his breath about older filings being a pain to index. Esther said nothing. She simply watched. His fingers moved across the keyboard, too fast to be thorough, and when the final confirmation screen appeared, he hesitated just long enough to glance toward the hallway that led to the sheriff's office. He reached below the counter, slid his phone from his lap, and without a flicker of shame or subtlety, sent a message with his thumb hovering over the screen like a man doing something important, but routine. She made note of the way his eyes didn't meet hers when he handed her back the receipt. No smile, no goodbye. Outside, the sun had climbed higher. The morning had begun to warm, but the chill in the pit of her stomach had nothing to do with temperature. The clerk had sent a message. That meant someone would soon be coming. And they did. The SUV arrived 2 days later, late enough in the morning that the fog had burned off, early enough that neighbors wouldn't be around to see it. It came up the drive slowly, tires too clean, suspension too smooth, The kind of vehicle that belonged in private parking garages, not gravel roads. Esther stood on the porch already, hands at her sides, waiting. She hadn't armed herself visibly, but her stance was enough. The man who emerged wore a deep navy suit that looked tailored, but intentionally unbuttoned at the collar. A pair of brown boots with dust smudged just enough to look worn, and an expression that tried to project concern but couldn't quite mask calculation. His blonde hair was combed back with practiced ease, and his sunglasses hung from the second button of his shirt, like a prop in a commercial. "Miss King?" he asked, stepping forward like he expected her to meet him halfway. She didn't move. "I'm Cal Briggs," he said, pausing for a beat as if the name ought to mean something. "I work with a group that partners with legacy landowners, folks like yourself, who've built something valuable and might be ready to transition into the next chapter." She raised an eyebrow. He pressed on. "I wanted to speak with you directly, respectfully, before things got too formal. You've got a beautiful piece of property here. Historic, good bones, and under all this charm, well, let's just say there's real value waiting to be unlocked." He let that last word hang in the air, like a salesman testing how far he could push, before revealing what he already assumed was his leverage. "I'm not selling," she said flatly. Cal smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't make it past the corners of his mouth. "Of course not. Nobody's asking you to rush. But we'd like to put something on the table, just so you know what's possible. We're not here to disrespect your legacy. Lord knows you've held this place down longer than most could, especially given everything else going on out here." He let his eyes sweep across the land, as if looking for evidence that she couldn't manage it anymore, as if the fall leaves and cracked dirt were proof that time had finally gotten the best of her. Then he took a small envelope from his inner coat pocket and placed it gently on the porch railing beside her. "Take a look when you're ready. There's more zeros than trouble. That I promise." Esther didn't look at the envelope. She looked at him. "You came out here to tell me I don't belong on my own land?" His smile tightened. "Not at all. I came to give you a choice. We like to work with folks who understand the world is changing. This isn't personal. It's just business. You've done well to hold on to this place, Miss King, but we both know. Land like this? It won't be quiet much longer. Might as well get something while you can still call it yours." There it was, not in the words themselves, but in the way he said them. The assumption that she didn't know what was best for her. The quiet implication that a woman like her, black and old, and living alone on a tract that white men now wanted, must somehow have missed the memo that it was time to let go. He didn't say anything vulgar. He didn't raise his voice. But Esther had lived long enough to recognize the tone behind the manners, the control buried inside the courtesy. She picked up the envelope, weighed it in her hand without opening it, and said, "You finished?" Cal tilted his head, clearly surprised. "Because if you're not, go ahead. I've got time," she continued, voice even but laced with steel. "But if you are, then take your boots and your offer and get off my land before I make you forget every dollar in that envelope." He didn't smile this time. He gave a stiff nod, took one slow breath, and walked back to the SUV without another word. As he drove off, kicking up a swirl of dust that lingered long after the vehicle disappeared beyond the tree line, Esther stood still on the porch, the envelope still in her hand, and listened to the wind roll in across her fields like a quiet warning already answered. The next few days unspooled with an unnatural stillness, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The town, which had already begun to shift in tone, now felt drained of warmth entirely. People who once waved from porches or paused to catch up outside the feed store now crossed the street when they saw her coming, their eyes darting quickly toward the ground as if something about her presence had become radioactive, Or worse, marked. No one said anything directly, but the silence around her felt less like absence and more like strategy, as though they were protecting something, or someone, by keeping her at a distance. She caught it first, in the way the store clerk bagged her goods, without looking her in the eye, or how the man at the gas station who used to joke about the weather now stiffened when she pulled up beside him. It wasn't fear exactly, nor was it pity. It was the same expression she had seen on young soldiers standing outside tents in far-off deserts, the kind that told you they'd already decided not to get too close, not to care too much, because they didn't want to feel responsible for what happened next. Back at the farm, the signs became less subtle. The first incident was the tire. She found it the morning after a rain, the ground still soft enough to show the shape of boots in the dirt, though the prints had been smeared by a sweep of leaves, like someone had tried too hard to cover their tracks. The front driver's side tire of her truck had been slashed, not deep enough to make noise or halt her immediately, but enough to fail if she'd gone over 40 on the highway, enough to flip a vehicle if the timing was right. She didn't swear, didn't call anyone. She just changed it, marked the location in her notebook, and took out a longer route map from her desk drawer, one that offered off-grid travel lines in case the roads became unreliable. A few nights later, her water line burst without warning. At first, she assumed it was age. The copper pipe had been installed decades earlier, but when she pulled it from the ground to inspect the damage, she found the break was clean, too clean. The metal snipped with something far sharper than wear and time. That night, she boiled rainwater and drank it without comment. The following morning, she rerouted her filtration tanks and began storing emergency reserves in sealed containers. It wasn't until she walked the goat pens near dusk and found her eldest nanny goat lying on her side, stiff and bloated, that the line between warning and declaration was finally crossed. The animal had been healthy, old, yes, but eating well, moving steady. There was no sign of a struggle, no evidence of illness, only the telltale foam at the mouth and the swelling in the joints that spoke of deliberate poisoning. Esther stood there for a long time, one hand braced against the fence rail, watching the last flies settle on the carcass like shadows with wings. She buried the goat herself at the edge of the north pasture, marking the grave with a stone she carved nothing into. That evening, as the sun slid low and the light stretched across the fields in long, honey-colored streaks, she descended into the cellar beneath the pantry and opened the reinforced cabinet that had not seen daylight in more than a decade. Inside, her sniper rifle lay in perfect alignment, wrapped in oiled cloth, each piece cleaned and checked every year on her birthday, out of habit, more than preparation. She unwrapped it slowly, testing the scope, calibrating the zero, running her fingers along the stock as though reading Braille. It was an extension of her body, as familiar to her as her own breath. She brought out her sidearm next, loading it with methodical care before sliding it into the holster clipped against the inside of her waistband. She returned to the porch not with fear, not with rage, but with a quiet sense of arrival, as though some long-dormant part of her had merely been waiting for permission to wake. The next few days were spent walking the land in measured silence, not to admire or harvest, but to catalog, diagram, and prepare. She moved through the fields with a tape measure, a compass, and a carpenter's chalk line, plotting distance against line of sight, marking every natural blind spot and elevation point. She sketched a map by hand, identifying angles of fire, backup shooting positions, and choke points near the fencing where her land narrowed between the oaks and the bluff. Trip wires were laid at shin height, looped with fine copper wire and camouflaged with straw. She rigged perimeter alarms using repurposed radios and pressure switches hidden inside overturned feed buckets. The windows were measured, blackout drapes trimmed and stitched with heavy cotton to absorb light. The barn was reinforced from within, reinforced not with planks or nails, but with anticipation. Every night before sleeping, she took a walk under the moon, counting her steps, watching for broken twigs, measuring silence by the absence of crickets. Then, on the 6th evening, just as the shadows deepened and the air took on the metallic scent of approaching rain, the SUV returned. Only this time, it didn't come alone. 2 more trucks followed, darker in tone, their headlights off, their tires cutting slowly across the gravel. Esther stood at the edge of her porch, hands tucked into the deep pockets of her jacket, not moving, not blinking, as Cal Briggs stepped out of the lead vehicle. The man beside him was taller, broader in the chest, with sleeves rolled high enough to show military tattoos faded by time or poor choices. Cal didn't wear the same polished confidence as before. This time, there was no pretense, no envelope, no introductions. Just a long, silent walk to the bottom step of her porch, where he stopped, looked up at her with something that wasn't quite a smirk, and said in a voice stripped of all charm, 2 weeks. That's all you've got left to come to your senses. He glanced toward the house, toward the barn, toward the horizon. After that, he continued, his voice low and even, you won't be able to stop what's coming. And you'll be real sorry you didn't take what we offered when it was still in one piece. She didn't speak. She didn't move. And when he finally turned to walk back to his truck, the only sound was the wind slipping through the corn and the low hum of his engine as it idled in the growing dark. The night after Cal's warning passed without incident, but it brought with it a silence that was too clean, too complete, like the stillness of a hallway right before a door bursts open. Esther slept lightly, boots beside her bed, rifle within reach, every breath measured, every muscle resting just beneath the surface of readiness. By morning, her decision had settled, not as a reaction to fear or pride, but as the only logical outcome when faced with a threat that no longer pretended to be anything else. She began her preparations the same way she once had in the mountains of Afghanistan, by walking the ground, not as a farmer, but as a soldier reconfirming terrain she already knew by instinct. Every corner of her land became a variable in an equation, every elevation point an advantage to be marked and leveraged. She moved deliberately through the grass, kneeling often to press her palm into the dirt, testing for softness, measuring depth, accounting for how the earth would shift beneath the weight of boots, not her own. The first tripwires went up at the edges of the west field, concealed by dried leaves and set low enough that no one would see them unless they crawled. Copper wires stretched between posts that appeared to be broken fencing, but were in fact carefully placed anchors, each one rigged to a series of buried chimes and pressure switches connected to an old CB radio system she'd reconfigured by hand. When the wires tripped, the signal would trigger a silent vibration beneath her floorboards. Not a sound, not a light, just a whisper through the bones of the house that someone had entered the outer ring. Inside the barn, she cleared the central corridor, moved the animal feed to the far wall, and reinforced the door with 2 heavy oak beams she'd kept for just in case, though she never said what the case would be. From a trapdoor beneath the grain bin, she pulled up a rusted tin box caked in dust and sealed with a code lock, her late husband's, untouched since the year he died. It took her a moment to remember the combination, but her fingers found it before her mind did. The muscle memory outpacing thought. Inside were the old journals, bound in canvas, and filled with his small, meticulous handwriting. There were notes on water lines, gas pressure levels, seismic readings taken long before modern scans confirmed what he already suspected. Tucked in the folds of the final notebook was a laminated map marked with red grease pencil slashes, locations across the property, notated in a cipher only she and he could read, symbols for observation points, line-of-sight corridors, fallback zones. Beneath the map, Wrapped in oiled cloth was the external drive. It bore no label, no markings, just a black shell and the weight of something left behind not for curiosity, but for survival. Esther set it aside, knowing it would come into play later, knowing the information it held would have value, either as a shield or a weapon. She spent the next 3 days wiring the house and land with hidden cameras, small enough to nestle in tree hollows and fence rails, powered by solar units, and fed into a laptop she kept under the false drawer of her writing desk. The screens flickered to life, quadrant by quadrant, until the entire property unfolded in real-time visuals. Every tree line, every gate, every approach, visible through at least 2 angles. She watched them for hours, adjusting lenses, recalibrating angles, noting where her own blind spots remained. That's when she found the first scout cam. It had been placed high in a tree near the eastern slope, camouflaged well, but not well enough for someone who had spent a career spotting glints of metal from hundreds of yards away. She climbed the ladder with care, removed the unit, and pried it open on the tailgate of her truck. It wasn't amateur tech. It was clean, small, and fed into a secured uplink. She smashed the internal chip with the butt of her screwdriver, tossed the shell into her burn barrel, and then circled the perimeter until she found the second one, tucked beneath a false knot in the bark of an old hickory tree near the creek bed. This one she didn't destroy. Instead, she rewired the transmitter, looped its signal, and fed it footage from 2 days prior. Calm land, no traps, no activity. A still life meant to trick the eye. If they were watching, they'd now be seeing nothing at all. That night, she reached out to Isaac. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice rough from bourbon or sleep. Though with Isaac, it was hard to tell which came first. "You back in the game?" he asked, before she even said her name. "I never left it," she replied, her voice low and steady. "You calling means you need a scan," he said. 4 square miles, stitched. I need heat signatures, recent tracks, anything crossing the timberline. I'll send it in 24. I'll pull from my NOAA backup. Should be clean. Make sure it is. If they're watching my land, they're watching everything. A pause followed, not from doubt, but from understanding. "You alone?" he asked. "I'm enough," she said. He didn't argue, just exhaled through his nose and said, "You always were. Check your inbox tomorrow." She hung up without goodbye. By the next morning, she had relocated her primary sniper nest to the old silo, its steel frame still stable despite the years, now cleaned and converted with sandbags, blackout tarp, and a mattress she cut down from the guest room. From this height, she had clear views of the road, the northern woods, and all 3 approach paths. She opened her rifle case, clicked the magazine into place, adjusted the scope by half a notch, then laid prone with the stock pressed against her shoulder. Her eye aligned to the glass, her breathing slowed, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the metal walls. She loaded the final round and murmured to herself with a tone that didn't tremble, didn't waver, didn't break. Not a prayer, not a curse. Just the same phrase she'd whispered in every country, every operation, every moment, where the trigger was her language and silence was the reply. 0 wind. The sky had folded itself into ink by the time the first vibrations reached the foundation of the house. Esther, lying flat in the loft of the silo, felt the subtle tremble through the stock of the rifle before she saw anything. A rhythm in the gravel, soft but intentional, like boots trying too hard to sound like footsteps left by deer. She didn't shift. She didn't blink. Her cheek remained pressed to the stock, her eye steady behind the glass, the reticle tracing the moonlit slope that led to the fence line near the cattle gate. Then came the light, or rather, the absence of it. 3 sets of headlights shut off in sequence, as the trucks crept in slow. The way predators circle when they've decided patience no longer matters. The vehicles fanned out without sound, their doors opening with the kind of caution that only comes from men who expect a fight, but assume they'll be the ones controlling it. Tactical boots landed in the dirt, gloves adjusted on forearms. Suppressed weapons raised into ready positions. None of them looked up. They moved in coordinated silence, spreading into formation like they had drilled it. She counted them as they advanced. 4 dismounting from the lead truck, 3 from the second, 2 more trailing in shadow from the third vehicle. Their gear was sleek, dark, made for quick, clean jobs. They weren't here to threaten. They were here to finish. She exhaled once through her nose, slowly, and squeezed. The first man never heard the shot. The bullet passed through his neck just above the collarbone, the exit wound blooming silently across his left shoulder before his knees gave out, and he folded sideways into the grass like a sack of grain. The others didn't notice at first, too focused on spacing and movement to realize they were already down a man. When they did, the second shot was already leaving the barrel. It struck the next target just as he stepped past a fence post wired with an old gravel mine. The shot caught him through the ribs, staggering him into the line. A second later, the wire snapped, and a burst of sharpened stone exploded upward from the buried canister she'd built from a repurposed fertilizer drum. The noise wasn't loud enough to echo, but it cracked the quiet like glass, and suddenly someone shouted the word she'd been waiting for. "Sniper!" The formation scattered, but they were already too exposed. She shifted positions without hesitation, sliding backward from the nest on her belly, never lifting more than an inch off the floorboards. Within seconds, she was down the ladder and crossing the field along the irrigation trench, the one she had carved deeper over the last week to give her a covered path between shooting positions. Mud clung to her elbows as she crawled, rifle slung tightly across her back, the sidearm at her hip silent, untouched. She didn't need it yet. They were firing now, blind, erratic, and panicked. The muzzle flashes stuttered from behind the storage shed and tree lines, but the aim was too high, too late, too desperate. She could tell they had trained, but not for this. Not for someone who knew the land better than they knew their own command structure. Not for someone who had been killing in silence since before most of them could shave. She reached her second nest, tucked into the broken corner of an old hay barn, the beams reinforced with sandbags, the crawl space beneath covered in burlap and coated with dust. The field ahead was now scattered with movement, shadows bobbing between trees, someone calling out position numbers that meant nothing in terrain this uneven. She pulled the bolt back, fed in the next round, and aligned the scope. Another man dropped, this one mid-sprint, a clean shot to the thigh that toppled him face first into the ditch. He tried to crawl, dragging himself through wet grass, but she was already dialing the range to finish him. She didn't pull the trigger right away. She watched him for a few seconds, his fingers digging into dirt, his lips moving like maybe he thought a prayer could stop what was coming. She pulled. The silence after each shot was worse than the shots themselves. It settled across the fields like a second skin, draped over the earth as if daring anyone to speak, to breathe, to believe they had control of the night again. But they didn't. She did. Down near the eastern fence, one of them set off a second trap, a tripwire rigged to a garden hoe and a propane flare. The burst of light ignited the underbrush for just long enough to expose 2 more targets who had ducked behind a pile of firewood. She couldn't hit them both from this angle, but she fired anyway. One dropped. The other ran, shouting into his radio for backup. She switched positions again. Each move was calculated, each nest pre-built with small comforts she had earned through repetition. Water bottles, a rolled cloth to rest her arm, a field map scratched into wood with nail points. She rotated through 4 positions before the trucks even thought to reverse, before the tires finally spun through the mud in retreat, dragging the wounded and the shaken back into their steel cocoons. The last thing they expected was to be hunted by a woman with gray in her hair and ghosts in her bones. The air inside the house had already changed by the time she reached the back door. It wasn't the smell of smoke or cordite or blood. Those came later. But the subtle disruption in the air pressure, the kind that whispered of opened doors and boots tracking across hardwood that had never known strangers. Esther crouched low behind the coat rack in the utility hallway, her sidearm drawn, her body balanced on the balls of her feet, her breath shallow and measured. The breach hadn't been explosive. They were trying to stay quiet, to move like shadows in a place built for ghosts. But her ears caught every board creak, every whispered signal between men who had trained for urban raids, but not for the house of a woman who had spent her youth threading death through buildings far less forgiving than this one. The first one moved through the kitchen, rifle angled low, flashlight flicking in wide arcs across the cabinets and tile. Esther let him pass the pantry before triggering the smoke bomb she had stashed in the oven's unused lower compartment. The room filled in seconds, thick white haze swallowing every outline. She moved through it like water, silent and precise, her shoulder grazing the edge of the breakfast bar as she ducked behind it and counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The second man entered through the side window, feet landing softly on the kitchen mat she had rigged with roofing nails punched through the underside. His shout was muffled, more pain than surprise, and she used the noise to mask her movement, sliding in behind the first man and striking the crook of his elbow with the butt of her pistol. The weapon clattered from his grip. He turned, stunned, only to receive a sharp strike to the bridge of his nose. Blood splattered the fridge door behind him as he stumbled backward into the sink. She didn't hesitate. Her left hand came up beneath his jaw, knife angled tight between fingers. She drove the blade into the soft space just under the chin and twisted sharply to the left. He dropped without a sound. A flash of light to her right warned her of the third man just before he opened fire. The bullet grazed her shoulder, the heat of it tearing through the outer fabric of her jacket and biting into skin with a sting sharp enough to jolt but not slow her. She dove behind the dining table, already reaching for the second smoke canister, tossing it overhand toward the hallway just as a boot struck the edge of the table, tipping it sideways and sending plates crashing. The flare hissed as it ignited, spraying sparks into the stairwell. The hall lit up in bursts, pulsing red like a heartbeat too loud in the ears. She saw the shadow of the shooter first, tall, fast, moving too confidently, and as he stepped forward, she fired from the ground, low and tight, catching him in the left knee. He went down screaming, the gun spinning from his hand and bouncing once before skidding into the baseboard. She rose quickly, shoulder burning, and retrieved the blade from her belt. Blood dripped onto the floor as she closed the distance between them, breathing hard but silent. And then, without ceremony or pause, she drove the knife into the base of his neck. He twitched once, then was still. A creak behind her, small, deliberate, someone moving slow. She didn't turn. Instead, she spun the desk lamp nearest her, casting its cone of light across the far end of the hallway, then dropped low, crawling under the table as the intruder entered from the rear stairwell. She watched his legs move past her hiding place, steady, careful, his breathing controlled. He was smart, checking angles, ignoring the distractions, but not smart enough. Esther reached up and pulled the cord on the swing lamp just above the bookshelf. The movement drew his eye for half a second, long enough. She lunged forward and stabbed upward. the blade slipping through the bottom of the lampshade and into his chest with a force that rattled the shade itself. The man gasped, staggered backward, and collapsed into a chair, gurgling as his lungs filled with blood. Only then did she pause, leaning against the edge of the wall, panting, her hand pressed to the bleeding groove along her shoulder. It wasn't deep, but it would need wrapping. Not yet. Outside, the gunfire had faded, the others having retreated, regrouped, or been taken down by her traps and scope. Inside, the only sound was the labored breath of one last man still alive. Barely. He lay face down near the kitchen entry, his rifle out of reach, his hand clutched around his side where she had struck him with the blunt edge of her blade, knocking him unconscious just moments before. She pulled a zip tie from the pocket of her coat, rolled him roughly onto his stomach, and bound his wrists with practiced speed. Then, with a grunt and one final breath to steady herself, she dragged his limp body down the hallway, through the back door, and across the yard toward the barn. Blood streaked behind her, dark and glistening in the cold moonlight. The war had entered her house. Now she would take the fight into theirs. By the time she secured the barn doors behind her and stepped back out into the field, the land had already begun to shift again. It wasn't the wind or the trees that moved, but the air itself, thicker now, heavier, pulsing with the kind of tension that comes not from fear, but from the certainty that what's coming next is built for destruction. The first wave had been a test, an underestimation. The next would be something else entirely. She made it halfway to the front pasture before she saw the silhouettes, larger this time, moving in tighter formation, heads low and shoulders square, like they'd done this before in places where mercy wasn't written into the mission. The trucks didn't stop at the road. They surged forward with engines cut and lights off, their tires rolling silently through the gravel and mud, as if they had trained for darkness and silence the way she had trained for silence and death. She counted 9 men on foot, moving fast, bodies bent beneath the weight of heavier gear, breech kits, shields, canisters strapped to packs, hammers in hand, their movement too clean for hired muscle and too reckless for law enforcement. From her vantage point behind the irrigation tank, she watched as 2 of them approached the back entrance, crouched low beneath the living room window. One of them held a gas canister, the other a sledge, and both looked up at the same time, nodding once before preparing to strike. She didn't wait. With a flick of her wrist, she triggered the tripwire that ran from the doghouse post to the base of the porch steps. The wire, invisible in the dark, snapped back the latch on a flare rigged above the gutter, and in a sudden burst of shrieking light, the front yard ignited in a blinding white blaze. They staggered back instinctively, shouting for cover, but the confusion had already begun to spread. 2 more men, who had circled wide toward the south pasture, ran straight into the claymore equivalent she had buried beneath the false trough. The explosion wasn't deafening, but it was precise, sending shards of jagged rebar and thick, wet dirt into the side of the tractor, and one of the attackers with it. She moved fast, darting from the tank to the garden trench, her shoulder flaring in pain with every stride. The leg wound she'd taken during the earlier fight had tightened, stiffening with cold and dried blood, but it didn't slow her. She reached the comms jammer beside the compost bin, a reconfigured field radio connected to a solar power cell, and a frequency disruptor she had purchased second-hand from a ham operator with questionable loyalties. She powered it on and slid the dial to the dead zone between law enforcement and commercial radio bands, watching the green light flash once, then hold. Their radios would be useless now. They wouldn't even know why. Shots rang out near the barn. Wild, scattered, desperate. She dropped flat against the row of overturned soil, crawled until she reached the fence post near the willow tree, and sighted in through the scope she had mounted on her backup rifle. One of the attackers had taken shelter behind her wheelbarrow, firing into the dark like it might answer him. She steadied her breath, exhaled, and squeezed. He dropped forward into the dirt, his body limp before it landed. At the house, they finally breached. The back door splintered under the weight of the hammer, the metal frames snapping with a groan that echoed across the yard like a church bell fractured by fire. Esther knew they would come through the kitchen first, that they would stack, clear, and assume their speed gave them the upper hand. What they didn't know was that she had removed the refrigerator from its usual spot and replaced it with a frame-mounted steel rod, bent at an angle, set just above eye level. She reached the porch seconds after they entered and slipped through the broken siding on the north wall. Moving through the smoke-filled hallways, she used their confusion against them. Two were already blinded by the flash flares, rubbing their eyes, weapons swinging low. A third moved with intention, pressing through the smoke, barking orders that didn't match military cadence. She ducked beneath a swinging flashlight beam, pressed herself against the pantry wall, and waited for the thud of his boot to pass the threshold. Then she struck. The rod connected with the side of his head, just above the ear, and the man dropped instantly, collapsing with a grunt into the floorboards. She reached down to roll him over and froze. Cal. His face, even bloodied and slack-jawed, was unmistakable. The same smug curve to the jaw, the same polished arrogance now collapsed in a heap beneath her kitchen light. She bound his hands quickly, dragged him by the shoulders through the hallway, and left him behind the upturned dining table before returning to clear the house. When the sun finally rose, it did so without drama. The field smoked in soft tendrils, patches of churned earth glowing faintly in the new light, and her porch was littered with debris, broken boots, spent magazines, a gas mask hanging from the rail like a piece of shed skin. 3 of them were alive. 2 of the subordinates lay unconscious in the grass near the west field, both stripped of weapons and gear, their arms tied behind their backs with electrical cord. Cal remained inside, groaning now, shifting slowly like he had expected to wake somewhere easier, softer, safer. Esther stood at the top of the porch steps, her body slick with sweat and grit, the blood on her shirt a mix of her own and others. Her breathing was even. Her eyes scanned the tree line, the road, the horizon, and when none of them moved, when no more trucks appeared, no second wave behind the second wave, she exhaled slowly, let her shoulders roll forward slightly, and whispered the same words her husband had once said after they'd survived a 36-hour siege in a forgotten compound on the edge of nowhere. "That's all of them, for now." Then she stepped down into the grass, her boots silent on the blood-wet ground, and went to collect what they thought they could leave behind. The barn, in daylight, looked unchanged to anyone unfamiliar with its second purpose. The wide red doors, worn smooth by time and sun, hung slightly crooked on their hinges, and the rusted latches still bore the marks of years gone by. Inside, however, the space had transformed. Not into something grotesque or monstrous. Esther had never needed theatrics to make her point, but into a place where silence was thick and deliberate, and every creak of wood or drip of water served a purpose beyond its sound. The 3 men sat bound to reinforced chairs she had bolted into the concrete days ago, each positioned at a slight angle from the others, just far enough apart that they couldn't whisper, couldn't see each other's expressions, but could hear everything. Their wrists were zip-tied, their ankles secured with paracord pulled tight against the floor brackets. Duct tape had sealed their mouths during transport, now removed with a slow, deliberate hand, not to grant them speech, but to measure their reaction to its return. Esther didn't speak for the first hour. She moved around them with quiet efficiency, adjusting lights mounted on portable tripods, wiping blood from her temple with a cloth soaked in cold rainwater, resetting the battery on the small field recorder she'd placed on the shelf above Cal's head. She let the barn settle into itself, the distant ticking of a leak in the roof, the wind pushing through the slats high along the back wall, and the slow, steady rhythm of water dripping from a metal bucket suspended just above the concrete near the far door. Every sound was intentional, and none of it was rushed. She poured water from a tin kettle into 3 canteens, left them just out of reach on the ground, then turned on a single hanging bulb that swung lazily above them, casting long, shifting shadows across the barn floor. When she finally pulled up a folding chair and sat facing them, her expression was unreadable. Not hard, not cruel, just quiet and entirely in control. "You came here to erase me," she said, her voice low and steady. "You failed." No one answered. One of the subordinates, wiry, younger, breathing through clenched teeth, shifted slightly in his chair. The other sat completely still, eyes closed, either conserving energy or pretending indifference. Cal met her gaze without flinching. Blood dried across his jaw where she had struck him, his right eye beginning to swell shut, but his expression remained composed, as if his training still whispered that posture was strength even here, even now. Esther stood, walked slowly to the back wall, and picked up a small handheld speaker connected to her recorder. She pressed play, and the room filled with the sound of gunfire, boots in mud, and distant voices shouting fractured commands from the night before. It wasn't just sound, it was proof, a timeline, a record of what had happened when they thought they were still in control. When the recording ended, she turned to the younger man. "You want to tell me who's giving orders now?" she asked. He didn't speak. She nodded once and walked to the light, tilted the bulb directly into his face, and stood silently as the heat began to work on his resolve. 10 minutes passed. 20. The sweat started to form at his temples, then trickled down his neck. He shifted again, blinked hard, swallowed dry air. Esther didn't touch him. She didn't shout. She simply moved the water bottle an inch closer, then stopped, letting the silence do the rest. "I'm not dying for this," he muttered at last, voice cracked and raw. "Who are you dying for, then?" she asked, crouching slightly, her voice calm and even. He hesitated. "We don't know names, just layers. We're told when, where, how. The money comes from out of state. Transfers, cash drops, sometimes fake construction bids." "And Cal?" she asked, without looking at him. "Middleman," the man whispered. "He tells us what land to clear." She walked over to Cal, crouched in front of him, meeting what was left of his gaze. "You want to keep playing the professional? Or should I let him keep talking?" Cal smiled, but it was tight now, hollow at the edges. "You're not gonna kill me, Miss King." "No," she said, "but I don't need to." She pulled a folder from the shelf, one of her husband's. She laid it open on the table beside Cal's chair, flipping through pages marked with land registry codes, transfer documents, and surveys all tied to the property surrounding hers. "You've been here before," she said. "Years ago. Quiet purchases, forced liens, families that left in the middle of the night. You were part of that wave too, weren't you?" Cal didn't answer, but the flicker in his expression was enough. She slid a photograph across the table, grainy, black and white, taken from a drone years ago, showing Cal standing with Cobb outside a state land auction office. "You think no one was watching," she said. "You think my husband didn't see what was coming." Cal's lips parted slightly. He inhaled but said nothing. She leaned in, voice quiet now, nearly tender. "You ever tell your daughter how you make your money, Cal? Because I will." I'll tell her, and I'll tell the courts, and I'll send the audio to every paper west of the Mississippi if I have to." His jaw clenched. "Sheriff Cobb," he said finally, his voice like gravel in his throat. "He gets the names. He gets the filings. He knows who to lean on. The rest of us, cleaners." "And the registrar?" she asked. Cal nodded once. "Her job was to delay your paperwork. You weren't supposed to file in time. Once the window closed, we move. Claim squatters' rights, stage a chemical spill, condemn the land. Same play, as always." Esther pressed stop on the recorder, then stood. "You put me on a list," she said, her voice low now, filled with something older than anger. "You had no idea what kind of name you were crossing out." She walked to the door, opened it to the cold morning light, and let the silence hang behind her like a judgment waiting to fall. Inside the barn, the men remained bound, but the story had already started to break. She didn't return to the house right away. Instead, she walked the edge of the property line, one slow step after another, her boots pressing deep into the still wet earth, the cold morning wind curling through the trees with the kind of hush that only followed a night of violence. The barn doors remained shut behind her, their interiors still cloaked in the weight of confession, and though the sun had fully crested the horizon, nothing about the light felt clean yet. There was a knowing in the air now, a shift, not just in what had been done, but in what had been revealed. By the time she stepped through her front door, the adrenaline had dulled to a quiet ache in her joints. Her hands, still lined with dried blood, moved with muscle memory more than thought as she lit the stove, boiled water, and poured herself a cup she never drank. The cup sat cooling beside the window while she reached into the drawer below the sink and pulled out the old green ledger she hadn't touched in years, the one her husband used to keep tucked beneath the third floorboard in the bedroom, marked only by a frayed ribbon and a single faint cross on the spine. The journal wasn't what it seemed. It never had been. The first few pages were lists, fencing materials, feed calculations, rotational crop plans, but after the second section, the entries changed. The writing grew tighter, more deliberate, and the dates became sporadic. Esther recognized the structure immediately. Operational shorthand, one they had used in the field when notes had to be disguised as logistics or inventory. Her husband, who had walked away from service with injuries no one could see, and a mind that stayed locked onto mission cadence, had embedded a cipher in his pages, just in case someone ever came looking to understand what he hadn't been ready to say aloud. She turned the journal sideways, angled it beneath the morning light, and followed the diagonal lines marked faintly in red pencil, coordinates hidden in supply totals, names buried in expense columns. The patterns were old but familiar, and as she decoded them, the truth began to take shape with painful clarity. He had known about the gas years ago, not from a neighbor, not from a company report, but from a quiet contract signed by an out-of-state agency that had flagged the mineral content beneath their land as high value. He hadn't told her because he'd been working to slow the process from within, using outdated surveys and technical obfuscation to stall exploration permits. He hadn't wanted her to worry. He thought he could buy them time. But someone had found out. The entries near the back grew darker. There were notes about meetings with a state officer, a man who had promised confidentiality, who had taken copies of the forged maps and said he would bury them beneath other filings until the political winds shifted. Esther read the dates carefully. One stood out, circled twice in black ink, and followed by only one more line, written in a hand that had started to shake. Meeting confirmed. Cobb's name came up. Need to be careful. That was the last entry. Her husband had died in a single-car accident on the highway. Back from that meeting, the truck found crumpled in a ravine. The report said the brakes had failed. No autopsy was ordered. Sheriff Cobb was the first on the scene. He had personally delivered the folded flag and the condolences. Esther closed the journal, her fingers resting on the frayed edge of the last page, her breath shallow but steady. The noise outside, birds, wind, the distant groan of tree limbs, faded until there was only the pulse in her ears and the weight of understanding settling in her chest. This hadn't been about a land grab, not entirely. It hadn't been just about the gas or the title or the money. It had been cleanup. A final piece of a plan started years ago, unfinished because her husband had stalled them too long. She hadn't just become a target because of the mineral rights. She had become a target because she was married to a man who had made it his mission to keep those rights hidden, and who had died for his trouble. She stood slowly, walked to the living room, and opened the drawer where she kept the last photograph of him, the one in uniform, standing beside her on the day they came home together for the final time. His smile in that photo wasn't forced or cautious. It was whole. "So that's why they really came," she whispered. Her voice didn't tremble. It carried the kind of quiet finality that sounded more like ceremony than grief. Outside, the barn remained locked. The men inside unaware that the story had shifted again, not just in their failure, but in the reasons behind it. Esther sat at her husband's old desk and opened the field radio, dialing in to a frequency they used to joke was for emergencies only. Static buzzed for a moment, then cleared. She keyed the mic and leaned in. "Isaac," she said, her voice low but deliberate, "I need you to pull the accident report from March 23rd, 8 years back. Franklin County. 1 fatality. I want every line of it. Witness statements, signatures, and the name of the responding officer." The pause on the other end was brief. "Copy," Isaac said. "That's going to take some creative reach." "I don't care what it takes," she answered. "And I want the drill site registry logs for anything filed near County Line 17 in the last 10 years. Look for aliases, out-of-state LLCs, anything that crosses with Cobb's name." He hesitated. "You're not slowing down, are you?" Esther didn't blink. "No," she said. "I'm just getting started." She set the mic down and picked up the photograph again. There would be no more half-measures. Not this time. The house was still, but there was no rest inside it. Esther moved with a calm sharpened by clarity, her body worn but unyielding, her wounds bandaged tightly beneath her sleeves. The storm had passed outside, but the real work, the kind built not on gunpowder but paper and proof, was only beginning. The confessions were still fresh in her ears, but she didn't play them back. She didn't need to. Every word was etched into memory now, and memory, unlike tape, didn't fray or skip. In the corner of the room, the old field laptop hummed softly, its fan whirring just loud enough to remind her that this part of the fight would require precision of a different kind. She inserted the SD card, the red one marked with an X in her late husband's handwriting, a relic of habit, long before external drives replaced most of their field tools. The files loaded without error. She opened the folders one by one, checking audio levels, scanning for timestamp mismatches. Each file was labeled meticulously. Confession 1, Cal Briggs. Confession 2, Operator Number 3. Confession 3, Target Sequence Breakdown. A master folder contained geotags, land records, corrupted transfer receipts, and a side-by-side comparison of the delayed filings cross-referenced with Cobb's name. Proof, not speculation. She encrypted the backups to 3 separate drives, 2 physical, 1 virtual, and placed one into a hollowed-out floorboard beneath the hallway rug, another into a waterproof pouch she buried beneath the azaleas in the west garden. The virtual version was uploaded to a secure cloud hub run by one of Isaac's old surveillance contacts in Nevada. Someone who owed them more than a few favors and didn't ask questions unless he was trying to keep you alive. By noon, 3 identical packages sat on the table, plain cardboard, sealed with craft tape, each one addressed by hand. One to a small investigative newsroom out of Mobile that had a reputation for chasing corruption cases the bigger stations wouldn't touch. One to a state government watchdog group that had sued Cobb's office twice in the last 5 years. And the third, the heaviest, bound for a retired federal prosecutor now running a legal podcast that had, just last month, publicly questioned the legitimacy of land seizures across the state's southern counties. Each box contained a thumb drive, a transcript, and a note written in Esther's measured hand. You don't know me, but you know the pattern. Here's what it looks like when someone survives it. She drove the parcels herself, using the old truck with the stolen plates Isaac had sent her last spring as a joke that had become useful in a way neither of them expected. She mailed each package from a different post office in 3 different towns, pausing in none of them long enough to register as familiar. At each stop, she left a small piece of her silence behind and carried nothing back but air. That night, with the barn secured and her house again dark, but fully wired, she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a name she hadn't written in years. Mariah Knox. She had seen her once, years ago, giving a talk at a veterans' rights rally about environmental displacement and legal protections for underserved landowners. The young lawyer had spoken not with anger, but with clarity. And clarity, Esther had learned, was rarer than rage in most people who fought against systems like this. Mariah had since made a name for herself challenging corrupt pipeline contracts and winning 3 injunctions against state-backed drilling corporations tied to interstate fraud. Esther hadn't needed her before. She did now. She placed the call just after 10. The phone rang 5 times before a calm, no-nonsense voice answered. Mariah Knox. This is Esther King. You don't know me, but you've been tracking my land. A pause, then the sound of a laptop keyboard tapping. You filed the mineral claim out of Franklin. 72 acres. Filed late, but it stuck. That's right. What happened? They came for me. At night, in numbers. Did you defend it? Yes, Esther said, and I recorded everything. Mariah's tone shifted, not with disbelief, but with engagement. Do you have documentation? 3 audio files, 2 names. 1 signed order blocking the mineral registration, forged by a county registrar. I have Cobb tied to LLC transfers, and a confession that includes the phrase, "She was always on the list." There was a sharp exhale on the other end. Then, silence. I've got a press connection at the Ledger, Mariah said finally, and I'm 2 weeks away from filing an ethics suit against the Energy Land Board. If I bring this to court, it changes the entire foundation of my case. Are you safe? Safer than they are. Good. Then here's what we're going to do. They spoke for over an hour, moving through details like 2 officers planning a joint operation. Mariah would coordinate the press release, anonymous source at first, but authenticated through geotagging and confirmed metadata. She would file for an emergency injunction on behalf of Esther, then expand the case to include whistleblower protection once the information went public. A civil racketeering charge would follow, naming Cal, Cobb, and the registrar, supported by the filed evidence, the audio confessions, and Esther's testimony. By the time Esther hung up, the legal fuse had already been lit. She leaned back in her chair, the ache in her shoulders settling beneath the surface again, and stared at the old wood beams above her head. This house, battered and patched and braced against storms both natural and man-made, had held. It would keep holding. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, not howling but whispering, as though the land itself had taken a breath. In the barn, the men remained tied, and the recorder clicked softly on its timer, logging each hour as further proof of life. And somewhere beyond the trees, far from the blood-soaked ground they had tried to take, Sheriff Cobb was already starting to feel the tremble of something he couldn't stop. The barn stood quiet in the distance, its weathered siding cloaked in morning mist, the rising sun casting long streaks of amber light across the yard. From the outside, nothing stirred. But within its walls, beneath the steady click of the timer and the faint rustle of shifting weight, the unraveling had already begun. Not with shouting or violence, but with silence and consequence. A reckoning that moved like groundwater, slow, unstoppable, and deeply rooted. The digital files were already gone, scattered across encrypted channels, funneled to news outlets, legal archives, and government watchdogs with precise timing and complete anonymity. Cal's voice, raw from confession, echoed across audio logs that matched bank records and land surveys, connecting names and faces that had long stayed hidden in plain sight. Every thread they had pulled was a thread Mariah Knox could trace. In Atlanta, Mariah moved like a machine, her office light never fully dark, her phone constantly blinking with pings from whistleblower networks, investigators, and reporters trying to piece together the scope of the operation. With Esther's help and Isaac's old radio scans, she charted a corruption web that extended far beyond Cobb's county badge or Cal's muscle. It bled into corporate acquisitions, political campaign donations, public grant misallocations, each layer hiding under the next like rot beneath polished floorboards. She followed money that had crossed oceans, cycled through offshore trusts, bounced through four-digit shell firms, and reappeared as bribes disguised as property adjustments. She mapped it all and didn't say a word until the whole picture stood in front of her. When the moment came, it did not arrive with fanfare. The federal raids moved just before dawn, deliberate and quiet, engineered to catch every door unlocked and every server still online. Black SUVs moved through gravel backroads and dark alleys, coordinated from a central command hub 2 towns over. Agents carried paper warrants sealed in tight packets, their movements as sharp as their timing. No announcements were made to local media. No early tips were leaked. The silence was strategic. They hit 7 locations in under 30 minutes. 2 large estates, a private airstrip hangar, a satellite office downtown disguised as a real estate agency, a riverfront lodge used for off-grid retreats, and 2 nondescript homes belonging to board members of the State Energy Commission. Each one housed boxes of unfiled paperwork, encrypted hard drives, and decades' worth of liability waiting to be exposed. Esther watched none of it on television. She sat at her husband's desk and stared at the grain in the wood, her hand resting on the same radio she had used to call Isaac only days before. She wasn't interested in headlines or photos. She had no desire to hear talking heads debate whether her actions had been legal or excessive. The land was still hers. Her name was still hers. That was all she needed. Meanwhile, Cobb's attempt to flee unfolded with a mix of arrogance and desperation. He had driven 3 states over in a rented SUV, his passport a forgery bearing a Florida birth date and a Mississippi license number that hadn't been valid in over a decade. He checked into a roadside inn under the name Leland Gibbons and paid cash. He bought new clothes from a local hunting shop, shaved in the mirror with trembling hands, and tried to vanish into the kind of quiet places he used to patrol with impunity. But the net had already closed. He was pulled over by a state trooper just past the levee. The vehicle flagged before he even crossed the county line. Inside the SUV, they found burner phones, a stack of cash in foreign currency, and a map with 3 border crossings circled in red ink. He didn't protest the cuffs. He just looked off into the trees as if they might open up and offer him one last escape. But there were no more exits. Back on Esther's land, the men she had left bound in the barn remained right where she'd placed them, silent, still, and in no position to run. She hadn't spoken to them since that final recorded confession. No threats, no questions, no gloating, just food left within reach, water refilled, and a heater humming low in the corner. Enough to keep them from freezing, but not enough to offer comfort. When the first federal agents arrived on her land, she met them at the gate with no weapon in hand, only a folder containing passwords to the encrypted backups and the digital key to her own logs. She pointed toward the barn and said, with a calm that carried no pride and no hesitation, "3 inside, all armed when they came, all alive now." They nodded, thanked her, and proceeded without another word. The agents processed the captives without incident, noting the medical attention they'd already received and the clear evidence of restraint, not cruelty. The men were shackled and led away, no longer soldiers or enforcers, but witnesses and evidence in a case they never thought would leave the county line. Cal, for all his bravado and threats, gave a full deposition within 48 hours. Faced with a wall of evidence, federal charges, and a string of accomplices eager to trade stories for lighter sentencing, he accepted the role of whistleblower. His testimony sealed 3 federal indictments and helped accelerate subpoenas against 2 sitting state energy commissioners. Back at the courthouse, Esther's paperwork, once stalled, lost, or conveniently delayed, moved through without friction. No more clerks side-eyeing her, no more misfiled signatures or forgotten stamps. Her legal title was restored, mineral rights secured, and ownership reaffirmed at every level. When asked if she'd be willing to appear in court or on camera, her answer was the same. No interviews, just closure. By week's end, the headlines had changed. What began as a missing permit case in a forgotten township had become a national story of land theft, corporate conspiracy, and one woman's refusal to yield. But Esther didn't watch the broadcasts. She stood near the barn, staring at the scarred dirt, where trucks had once rolled in and bled back out, where boots had pressed deep into her ground with arrogance, thinking she would fold. She didn't fold, and they would never forget the cost of underestimating her. The indictments came swiftly once Cal's statement was entered into evidence. In a sealed courtroom session attended by federal prosecutors and forensic auditors, his confession, matched with GPS logs, recorded wire transfers, and internal correspondence pulled from seized servers, became the keystone in a case that had been quietly building momentum behind the scenes. One by one, members of the State Energy Board, city zoning officials, and regulatory agents who had rubber-stamped illegal contracts began submitting their resignations. Some cited personal reasons. Others vanished behind non-disclosure agreements. But the headlines told a clearer story than any official memo. A coordinated effort to defraud vulnerable landowners in favor of a syndicate hidden behind shell companies and offshore accounts. The men tied in Esther's barn had been transferred into FBI custody by the time the morning sun reached its peak. She had left the barn doors open, deliberately, so the agents could see the evidence without obstruction. They found the captives fed, bandaged where necessary, and seated beneath a blinking camera that had logged every hour of their captivity. Esther had kept everything clean. No bruises that didn't come from the fight, no injuries inflicted after surrender. They had been given blankets, water, and medical aid. One of the agents, after reviewing the footage, simply nodded and made a note in his report. Subject used non-lethal restraint and demonstrated clear intent to preserve life once targets were incapacitated. There were no further questions. As for the ones who had not lived through the night, their bodies were recovered with care, tagged and bagged by professionals who knew better than to ask Esther what had happened in the dark. The evidence told the story for her. The propane flare near the firewood stack, the shrapnel pattern by the southern fence, the deep impressions left behind by the breaching hammers still clutched in dead hands. Each piece aligned with her account, and matched the timestamps from her mounted cameras. The federal report would later classify all 10 deaths under defensive action taken during an organized armed assault. It was a legal term, but one that carried no stain on her name. Sheriff Cobb didn't run far. After failing to cross state lines using a falsified identity and a rental car procured under an expired drilling license, he was taken into custody by a quiet task force stationed at the county line. His suitcase held more than fake credentials. It held a thumb drive encrypted with bribe records, land grab directives, and a partial list of targeted properties. Esther's name was circled in red ink. He had no chance to speak for himself in court. His arraignment was closed to the public, and though his mugshot leaked within hours, the press release simply read, "Charged with conspiracy, racketeering, and obstruction of justice in a multi-state fraud case." He was denied bail. Mariah Knox handled the rest with surgical precision. She and Esther reviewed every document together at the old kitchen table where the war had begun. It was there, beneath the soft light of a single lamp, that they laid out the paths for restitution. Esther's mineral rights were not only honored, but secured under full federal protection through a clause in the Whistleblower Land Security Act, a provision rarely used, but invoked in light of the attempted land seizure and violence she had endured. The rights were irrevocable. The land could never be touched without her express permission. No more loopholes, no more games. When Mariah offered Esther a seat on the advisory board for the new Land Protection Coalition, named in honor of her fight, Esther declined with the same quiet certainty she had carried through the worst of it. "I didn't do this to join another room full of people with opinions," she said plainly. "I did it so the next black woman holding a deed doesn't have to pick up a rifle just to keep her ground." Instead, she used part of her settlement, not the hush money from lawsuits, but the clean federal payout tied to protected mineral claims, to establish the King Land Trust. Its mission was simple: to locate, defend, and preserve black-owned farmland across the South. No politics, no cameras, just quiet paperwork, legal firepower, and permanent ownership that couldn't be stolen by forged bids or buried clauses. The men who had come for her never spoke her name again in court. Cal pled to a reduced sentence in exchange for everything he knew, which turned out to be considerable. The two men captured beside him accepted plea deals as well. Their silence traded for time. None of them saw the inside of her barn again. And the land itself, the fields that had once hidden traps and soaked up blood, grew quiet again. Not in the sense of forgetting, but in the way trees remember storms without needing to speak of them. Grass regrew over the buried safe. The fence posts stood tall once more. And in the far corner of the property, where the dirt ran redder than anywhere else, Esther placed no marker. She let the wind have that place. When asked later why she refused every media request, every feature article, every invitation to speak, she answered only once. And it was to Mariah, sitting on the porch one evening as the sky bled orange behind the hills. "They already got my story," she said. "I don't need to sell it back to them." The new boards on the shed didn't match the old ones. They were smoother, paler, and still smelled faintly of sawdust and fresh stain. But Esther didn't mind. She ran her hand along the grain, feeling the clean lines where chaos had torn through weeks ago. Around her, the sounds of rebuilding were soft but constant. The low scrape of a trowel, the rhythmic thump of boots against dirt, the occasional hammer tap when someone found a stubborn nail. None of it was rushed. The volunteers who showed up didn't come with speeches or sympathy. They came with tool belts and thermoses, old habits from lives spent in uniforms, carrying quiet knowledge of what it meant to lose something and then build again. The shed was first, but not the last. Across the western acres, A new structure rose slowly over the summer, low to the ground, broad in its footprint, with rooms that opened onto wide porches and halls designed without corners. It was a retreat, built not for ceremony or accolades, but for use. Veterans came from counties near and far, some wearing their fatigue in the curve of their spines, others in the way they looked at tree lines a second too long. They didn't ask what had happened on the land. The wind still carried the echoes, and the dogs made sure no one got too close without permission. But they respected the quiet, and that was enough. Mariah visited now and then, usually on weekends, bringing updates on legislation, land rights victories, and sometimes just cornbread and black coffee. She always parked in the same spot, just shy of the willow tree that leaned over the gravel drive like it had been listening through the whole fight. Esther kept her company on the porch, where the two women sat without urgency, without needing to fill the space with anything more than presence. Occasionally, they'd talk about the trust, how many acres had been added, what counties were next, how to handle new threats wrapped in friendlier language. But more often than not, they simply watched the sun go down. One morning, just after dawn, the front screen door creaked open, and a flash of brown fur darted out across the porch steps. The pup was fast, full of bark and energy that seemed too big for his small frame. He circled the garden twice before darting straight into a rake, knocking it over with a clang that sent birds scattering from the trees. Esther didn't flinch. She stepped slowly into the light, leaning on the cane that now supported her right side, and looked at the chaos unfolding in her yard. "Bullet," she called calmly. The pup stopped mid-spin, turned, and bounded back toward her, skidding to a halt just shy of her boots. She crouched slowly, one hand steadying herself on her knee, the other reaching out to stroke the top of his head. "You'll learn," she murmured. "Everything worth protecting takes time." Each morning, she walked the fields again. Not all the way to the borders. Those paths were longer now, and her legs still stiffened when the air turned cold. But enough to let the land see her, to let it know she hadn't forgotten what it cost to hold it. The cane tapped against the dirt with a rhythm that had replaced the weight of a rifle, but it didn't mean less. She paused often, at the edge of the garden, at the slope that overlooked the creek, at the small patch of earth where the blood had soaked deepest. And she looked not for intruders, but for life, a new sprout, a bird's nest in the fence post, the tracks of a deer she'd seen once, but never again. And when she stood at the center of the highest field, the one where the wind always came first, she let her gaze sweep wide across the open ground, then down to the house, then back again. She said the same thing each time, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, except maybe the land itself. "I'm still watching." The breeze carried the words across the grass, past the repaired fences and fresh-turned soil, into the hollows, where voices once whispered threats, and now only echoed the sound of leaves turning over in the wind. Behind her, the house stood firm. Ahead, the horizon waited. Not for war, not any more, but for whatever came next. The grave was tucked at the edge of the north pasture, beneath a canopy of sugar maples that dropped golden leaves in October, and a cool hush year-round. Esther hadn't been there in 10 years, not because she had forgotten, not because grief had turned her away, but because the silence between them had always been understood. He'd once told her that real love didn't need constant tending, that their bond was rooted deeper than words, deeper than place, deeper than time itself. Still, that morning she rose early, dressed without looking in the mirror, and walked the full stretch from the house to the tree line with a slow, deliberate grace that didn't ask the land's permission. It already knew her weight. She brought no flowers, just the flash drive. It fit between her fingers like something far older than a modern device. More like a coin worn smooth by purpose, its contents heavier than plastic could explain. She knelt with care, her knees resisting the movement, but not enough to stop her. The dew hadn't burned off yet, and the chill touched the hem of her coat as she reached forward and slid the flash drive beneath the corner of the stone. It wasn't meant to last there, but it was meant to mark something, a final act, not of vengeance, but of closure. The headstone was plain, just the way he'd asked for. No rank, no war dates, no platitudes, just his name, and beneath it, the words, "Stand quiet. See far." Their old field mantra, etched in stone. She sat back on her heels, exhaled once through her nose, and let the breeze carry her voice. "They came here thinking I'd fold," she said, her tone even, steady, not softened by sentiment, but not hardened by pain either. "Thought this old house was just that, old. Thought I was past fighting. Thought you weren't still here." She glanced toward the horizon, then back to the name in the stone. "But you married a sniper." The silence settled again, but it was not empty. It was full, stretched wide like the pause before a sunrise, waiting only for memory to rise. And with that, the air around her seemed to slow, and what followed was not seen, but remembered. A flash of heat, her younger self, hair pinned under a cap, breathing through the scope at the edge of some distant hill. Heartbeat synced with the wind, eyes sharp and unshaken. The grip of the rifle steady, her finger poised not out of aggression, but duty. Then the softer warmth of her husband's laugh, sun-soaked and reckless, echoing from a jeep parked outside a tent in Kandahar. Him teasing her about how she never missed, how she made even silence feel tactical. She'd rolled her eyes, but smiled anyway, because he was the one person who never looked at her like she needed fixing. Another memory bloomed. The night he brought her to this land, told her the soil was good, that it had veins of strength running through it just like her. They had stood on this very field and watched the sky turn from copper to indigo, not saying much, just letting the future wrap around them without fear. And then, that last conversation, years later, right before he left for that meeting, the one that cost him everything, his hand on her shoulder. The words he didn't say, but didn't need to. And her promise, unspoken, that if anything ever happened, she would hold the line, no matter what shape the threat took. She blinked once, slowly, and the present returned. Her fingers grazed the edge of the stone, not to clean it, not to fuss, just to feel that it was still there, that he was still here. Not watching from above, not whispering from the trees, but resting. Because now, finally, she could tell him it was done. She rose, using the cane for balance, and stood facing the pasture. Bullet sat nearby, watching with a tilt to his head, as if he knew this wasn't just another walk. "You can rest now," she said, not to the wind, not to the earth, but directly to the space between them. And with that, she turned and made her way back down the worn path toward the house, the cane tapping steady rhythm against the ground, the flash drive tucked safe beneath the stone, and the sun rising strong behind her back. The camera crew arrived late in the afternoon, their van rolling up the gravel path with cautious tires, as if even their equipment understood it was trespassing on sacred ground. Esther had agreed to the interview only after they promised two things: that she would have the final word, and that nothing would be edited to soften the truth. No narration, no dramatization, no pity. She wore a dark blue button-down shirt, sleeves rolled just past the wrist, and a silver pin at the collar that once belonged to her husband. Bullet lay by her feet as the director adjusted sound levels and tried not to stare too long at the rusted traps lined neatly on a shelf behind her. The old barn, now swept clean, smelled faintly of cut wood and earth. as if it too had been preparing for this conversation. When the camera blinked red, she didn't speak right away. She let the air hold, let the crew shift uncomfortably in the silence. Then, her eyes fixed past the lens, steady as the scope she'd once lived behind, she began, not with a dramatic retelling of the night's violence, but with the soil. They didn't come here for the house, she said. Didn't care much for the fence or the well or even the grass. They came for what was buried, and they thought I wouldn't know how to fight for something I couldn't see. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch when they asked if she regretted anything. Instead, she told them about history. Not the kind written in textbooks, but the kind written in deeds filed late. Signatures forged, land taken without gunfire, just pressure and silence and slow erasure. She spoke not like a victim, but like a sentinel, someone who had seen the pattern long before the world caught up. The footage aired 3 weeks later in a primetime slot with minimal promotion, and still it spread like wildfire. Something about her presence, her refusal to be softened or made symbolic, resonated deeper than the producers expected. What began as a profile on a lone landowner resisting a corporate assault became a national reckoning. Because hidden in the records Esther had helped surface, alongside Mariah's tireless documentation, was a pattern that spanned 3 states, 5 different counties, 7 families, all black, all targeted for mineral rights beneath land long written off as forgotten. One company name showed up on every paper trail, though never at the top. Shell corporations with names like Green Horizon LLC and Southern Future Ventures. Auction house signatures from frontmen with no digital footprint. Land agents who disappeared when subpoenas were issued. But the dots connected. And when they did, the federal probe expanded. By the time the indictments were unsealed, over a dozen officials had resigned or been placed under investigation. Esther's own case, once just a backwoods anomaly, now anchored a national scandal. She turned down every speaking engagement, every podcast, every guest lecture invitation. She did not want to be turned into a brand, but she agreed to sit for one last segment, months later, filmed quietly on her porch with no makeup crew, no microphone clipped to her collar, just her voice and the steady rustling of the wind through the stalks. "I don't need a statue," she said. "Just leave the land alone. Let it rest the way we never got to." And so the last shots of the broadcast weren't of boardrooms or courtrooms, but of her hands planting new seedlings near the edge of her property. The same place where her husband once swore they'd grow their own food again, even if the world forgot how. Bullet-nosed at the soil beside her, tail thumping, ears twitching in the breeze. In the distance, the rebuilt shed cast a shadow in the shape of a rifle rack, now empty. The wood polished, but unarmed. A flag flew on a short pole nearby. Not the national one, but a faded green banner with the initials of her husband's old unit stitched by hand. The land didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. It felt like memory finally given space to breathe. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.